Welcome. Welcome to all those attending the seminar, both in person in our conference rooms and online. I'm very glad to open this webinar for several reasons. First, because it is the first of a series of initiatives that we launch on the occasion of the opening of COP23, the 23rd Conference of the Parties that takes place in Bonn. It was opened this morning at 10 and will last for the next weeks. The International Center for Climate Governance decided to devote the first week to a series of initiatives, and this webinar is the first one, and we'll have other webinars and conference and other proposals that you are all welcome to attend in the next day. Today, the webinar is particularly important for the second reason. The second reason is that it is devoted to the presentation of a lecture delivered by the winner, the organization, and representative of the organization winner of our international award. As you probably know, the International Center for Climate Governance delivers an award which is given to the best performing think tank working on climate change. Of course, could be climate change policy, could be climate change research, it could be a research center or a more policy-oriented think tank. But certainly, the rule of the award is that it should not be linked to a university, so independent from university. And we have two awards. The first one is given according to the absolute ranking that doesn't take into account, therefore, the size of the organizations. And the second one is the standardized ranking that takes into account the size, so even smaller organizations, smaller research centers, and think tanks can win the award. But probably the most important one is the absolute ranking. And this year, the winner of the award is the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research. It's an important research center based in Leipzig, in Germany. And the score of the center, based on several indicators, several parameters that measure not only academic performance in terms of publications, but also impacts in terms of events, communication, conferences, and so on and so forth. The winner has been the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research. Second was the International Institute for Applied System Analysis, IASA, and third, Nature Conservancy in the United States. So three big institutes who deliver a lot of interesting and important research every year. The award, of course, will continue, and you are all invited to visit the ICCG International Center for Climate Governance website, where you will find a think tank map. And this map will provide information on all most important research center, climate-related research center around the world. So we'll get information about them, their own activities, and of course the ranking that every year we update using information that are partially provided by the different research centers and partially provided by our team that collects this information to construct the different indicators and then produce the final ranking. The winners, the two winners, the one of the absolute ranking and the one of the standardized ranking, are proposed to deliver a lecture, and I'm very grateful to Dr. Josef Settele for having accepted to deliver this lecture on behalf of the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research. The lecture will be on climate change impacts on terrestrial biodiversity ecosystem, and I will give the floor to Professor Bosello, who will moderate this webinar. Will introduce Dr. Settele, will introduce the lecture, and at the end we'll coordinate questions, and of course you are all welcome to address questions to Dr. Settele and to participate in the discussion at the end of his presentation. So thank you very much. Congratulations to the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research. I'm really glad to give this award to the USZ. And I'm really grateful for all of you for participating in this webinar. Francesco, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Carraro. Let me also welcome again all those who are following this seminar, those who are here in person and those who are here in remote. Let me introduce Professor Settele. He's head of animal ecology and social-ecological research at the Department of Community Ecology at the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research. But more important for the today presentation is co-chair of the Global Assessment of the Intergovernmental Platform of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and he was also coordinating lead author in the last assessment report of the IPCC on the chapter exactly on terrestrial and inland water systems. This allows us to introduce immediately the topic of today's seminar, which is devoted to present the major findings of these two important publications on related to climate change impacts on terrestrial and biodiversity ecosystem and biodiversity. This is a very hot topic, especially because all claims that climate change impacts on ecosystem and biodiversity are probably the more important and threatening impact of climate change. At the same time, not much is known about the degree, the extent at which, with which climate change threatens this ecosystem. Not to mention two important issues, that is the, let's say, relative importance of climate change versus human-induced pressures, even though, of course, climate change has its anthropogenic origin, and also the issue of the economic assessment of those losses. So we are very curious and interested in what Professor Settele could tell us about this topic. Before giving you the floor, Josef, I just want to mention that those who would like to raise questions are welcome to type those questions in the questions windows in the control panel sheet of the webinar. We are going to read these questions after the presentation. More or less, we give 30 minutes with flexibility to the presentation, and then we will open the Q&A section. So, Josef, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for the very nice introduction. And first of all, thank you very much for awarding us this ICCG award. So we are very proud of this, and on behalf of you have said, once again, it's really very much appreciated. Thanks also for your kind words about my activities. What I will try today is summarizing some of the main findings of our IPCC chapter, and bringing some examples also from the IPBES, especially pollination assessment. As you said, I worked for IPBES for quite some time, presently now as co-chair of global assessment, but I was also working as CLA in the pollination assessment on the driver's part, which included climate change. So first of all, if you want to get in touch with me also after this seminar, below there is my email, and I try to answer emails, let's say, in a reasonable short time frame. So josef.settele@ufz.de, just feel free to send something to me, and I will surely reply after some time. So as I said, I will focus on some of the results of the IPCC. That's Working Group 2, Assessment Report 5, published in 2014. That's the cover page of one half of the report. The citation, I just give it here briefly, but I can send it to you, as I said before also, where you can get all the information I used today. Most of the graphs, most of the text is taken from these documents. And I will also insert some elements from the IPBES, Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform, at a later stage. Also, there are two citations which you can always have ask from me, or maybe also have it somewhere online already now. Okay, so I will start on the top level of the last IPCC report in the summary for policymakers, where lots of people have been involved drafting this document. And I want to highlight some of the key findings with relevance to terrestrial biodiversity and ecosystems. We had different parts. Part A is the observed impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation in a complex and changing world. And I will take some examples of observed impacts. And this is one of the first statements that in recent decades, changes in climate have caused impacts on natural and human systems on all continents and across the oceans. And the evidence of climate change impacts is strongest and most comprehensive for natural systems. But also for anthropogenic systems, there are some, let's say, good indications for strong impacts, like, for example, in the food sector. As a general remark, attribution of observed impacts in the Working Group 2 assessment report generally links responses of natural and human systems to observed climate change, regardless of its cause. So whether it's human-made climate change or natural one, we can't differentiate, so it's all taken together into one. So one of the top statements we made there was that in many regions, the changing precipitation or melting snow and ice are altering hydrological systems, affecting water resources in terms of quantity and quality with a medium confidence, which means we have quite some good studies on this, and they show in similar direction, so the confidence is quite okay. It's not top, but it's quite okay. An important aspect there was that glaciers continue to shrink almost worldwide due to climate change. There's a high confidence, affecting runoff and water resources downstream. And climate change is causing permafrost warming and thawing in high latitude regions and in high elevation regions, very high confidence. The latter is quite important in terms of vanishing ecosystems towards the northern and southern part of the globe. Coming to the species, this is a summary statement from terrestrial, freshwater and marine species. They have shifted their geographic ranges, seasonal activities, migration patterns, abundances, and species interactions in response to ongoing climate change. There is high confidence in this finding. Although we have to say that while only a few recent species extinctions have been attributed as yet to climate change, natural global climate change at rates lower than current anthropogenic climate change caused significant ecosystem shifts and species extinctions during the past millions of years. So there's a strong indication that the much faster effect of climate change will have much more profound effects than the historical one. If we look at future risks and opportunities for adaptation, we go into the key risks across sectors and regions, and we identified in total 8 key risks, and number 8 is exactly the one we are talking about today: risk of loss of terrestrial and inland waters ecosystems, biodiversity, and ecosystems, goods and services and functions they provide for livelihoods. And we named this reasons for concern. There's a graph on the next slide, which is a bit more complicated, so I try to go a bit into this. Can you see my mouse here, I think? So on the right-hand side, we have this, what we called these 5 integrative reasons for concerns, which provide a framework for summarizing key risks across sectors and regions, so for the entire Working Group 2 report. There we have the one, for example, here, unique threatened ecosystems, systems, then extreme weather events, distribution of impacts, global aggregate impacts, and large-scale singular events have been the 5 reasons for concern. And on the left and right-hand side, you see the change in temperature. If we take this one here, these are the 2, let's say, extreme RCPs, the regional concentration pathway scenarios, which end up at around 4.5 degrees centigrade here on average in the RCP 8.5, is it called, or the low one, which is RCP 2.6, a low emission mitigation scenario with 1.5 degrees relative to pre-industrial times. This lower one equals something like only 1 degree of increase in temperature, while the upper one goes to 3.7 or yeah, it's 4.5, depending on how you look at it, degrees different from now. Now, going into this reasons for concern, I want to highlight a few examples. That's one against the overview. There's 5 types we had here. And I just want to take out number 1, which is the unique and threatened ecosystems. So some unique and threatened systems, including ecosystems and cultures, are already at risk from climate change, high confidence. The number of such systems at risk of severe consequences is higher with additional warming of around 1 degree centigrade. So you can see already it's turning reddish, which means the level of additional risk is quite high already. It's getting very high, above 2 to 3 degrees centigrade warming. Many species and systems with limited adaptive capacity are subject to very high risks with additional warming of 2 degrees, particularly Arctic sea ice and coral reef systems. They are heavily impacted. So that's one of the top findings from our summary for policymakers of the last report. I take number 4, which is the global aggregate impact, is this one here. Risks of global aggregate impacts. to both Earth's biodiversity and the overall global economy. There's extensive biodiversity loss with associated loss of ecosystem goods and services results in higher risks around 3 degrees centigrade additional warming. So if you move in this direction, here it gets much more reddish and means with high risk. There's an expert judgment all across the authorship of this assessment have been around 350 people. The aggregate economic damages accelerate with increasing temperature, but few quantitative estimates have been completed for additional warming around 3 degrees or above. So just these two examples of key risks of reasons for concern in this whole grammatic way of showing it. Now going into the section B2 of our report, still the summary for policymakers, sector risks and potential for adaptation. I just picked out some examples of terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems. So a large fraction of both terrestrial and freshwater species faces increased extinction risk under projected climate change during and beyond the 21st century, especially, this was a point mentioned before by the moderators, as climate change interacts with other stressors such as habitat modification, overexploitation, pollution, and invasive species. So there's high confidence, especially on this interactive part. So extinction risk is increased under all regional concentration pathway scenarios, with risk increasing with both magnitude and rate of climate change, not surprisingly, of course. Many species will be unable to track suitable climates under mid and high range rates of climate change, which starts with 4.5 scenario, which is already 1.8 degrees. So from 1.8 to 2 degrees onwards, we have lots of problems in tracking the change during the 21st century. And lower rates of change, which is the 1.0 actually degrees centigrade, will pose fewer problems. But 1.0, as you know, is quite a, let's say, wishful thinking scenario already. If you look at this graph here, that's a summary graph showing different groups of organisms and how they move across the landscape. So it's based on a large number of literature, hundreds of studies, and you can see here on the here the groups, trees, plants, then mammals, and etc. On the y-axis, the maximum speed at which species can move, that's kilometers per decade. So for example, here 40 kilometers per decade, that's something which is only reached by a few groups of species, some snails, surprisingly, insects, of course, some of the mammals, and also, of course, some of the different groups of mammals. Now, what we put here as well is the change, under climate change, how much you would have to move in order to track climate change. So let's take one example here, high, let's say, increase of 4 degrees centigrade, RCP 8.5, global average means you have to move 20 kilometers per decade in order to track the climate change. This can be done for different geographical settings. For example, if you go into flat areas, which is the line up here, you can see you need around 70 kilometers per decade because their climate change is moving much faster, while in mountain areas it's very low because you can easily reach, let's say, the next suitable conditions, which are maybe some 100 meters above the present constellation. So the biggest problem for moving across landscape is, of course, the flat landscape and the high temperature changes. You might be surprised that, for example, here snails are mentioned as highly, let's say, dispersive organisms, but this includes, for example, lots of passive transports across landscapes. For example, if snails are in the feathers of birds, for example, and taken from one place to another one. You can see here with plants, the problem is much higher because, as we all know, they are not, trees especially, are not really fast moving. Now it takes a long time to make a certain distance, and the median is just around a bit above 0 kilometers per decade, which they can make. Only some extremes are a bit faster with more dispersal, for example, in seeds. So that's one of the graphs where we try to summarize very complex findings. There's a much more complex one in the main chapter, chapter 4 of the assessment, which you can have a look at if you're interested in the details. Okay, within the century, the magnitudes and rates of climate change associated with medium to high emission scenarios, which are all the ones from 2 degrees onwards, pose high risk of abrupt and irreversible regional scale change in the composition, structure, and function of terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems, including wetlands. And examples that could lead to substantial impact on climate are the Boreal tundra Arctic system with medium confidence or the Amazon forest with low confidence. Knowledge here is not very good, but we have some indication that also there we are facing quite some, let's say, tipping point type of problems. Carbon stored in the terrestrial biosphere, for example in peatlands, permafrost, and forests, is susceptible to loss to the atmosphere as a result of climate change, deforestation, and ecosystem degradation. So again, here the combination of climate change with other anthropogenic factors. Just one example, this well-known, maybe well-known Boreal tundra biome shift. That's a graph taken out of our report. And for example, if you take the interactions, let's start at the very north. That's a northerly thing here. You have the sea ice retreating due to warming, so global warming. The blue one leads to sea ice retreating. This needs to decrease in albedo, and then it strengthens global warming. So there are some feedback loops in here. And you can also see here the tundra is moving further to the north. But then, of course, there is the coast, there is the sea, there is no place to go. That's why this tundra biome shift might be a kind of, let's say, dead end in the medium term if we continue having this kind of high change in climate, which might simply lead to a loss of still presently very huge tundra area because there is no way where this system can go. I don't go into all the details here, but there are many other aspects which are among the climate change factors which influence this tundra biome shift. For example, here, increased fire intensity due to drought, etc. And of course, the thawing of the permafrost soil is a very important thing. And that's something which you cannot really, let's say, adapt to. There is no way of adaptation. So if I take it to summary, that's taken out of our chapter now, again, not from some of the policymakers. There is this Boreal tipping point, and these Arctic ecosystems are vulnerable to abrupt change related to the thawing of permafrost and spread of shrubs in tundra and increase in pests and fires in boreal forests with medium confidence. And there is hardly any adaptation option in the Arctic. There might be adaptations, for example, in the Amazon area, for example, fire management and the kind of forestry regime could be a possibility for adaptation. But here in the Arctic, there is hardly anything you can really do besides avoiding too much climatic change. In general, we have the effect of increased tree mortality and associated forest diebacks, which are projected to occur in many regions over the 21st century due to increased temperatures and drought. And the forest dieback poses a risk for carbon storage, biodiversity, wood production, water quality, amenity, and economic activity. Now, what we have compiled in our report is a map where we see studies which show the drought and heat-induced tree mortality around the globe. And you can see there's different dots on the map. The red ones are localities compiled through a kind of review paper by Allen et al. 2010. And then we analyzed further papers in the last, from 2010 to 2014, which are not included there, the white dots. And we have broad areas which are described, but particularly post-2009 publications where you have large impacts of drought and heat on tree mortality. So these areas here in the Sahel, in the Mediterranean basin, for example, but also partly in South America, in the Amazon area. So this is just a summary which shows there are lots of evidences for this effect, tree mortality induced by climate change, induced to drought and heat. Now going down in detail to our chapter, which is terrestrial inland water systems, as was mentioned before, there was a big team working on this, and I was one of the CLAs together with Bob Scholes, who is now, for example, co-chair from the degradation assessment of IPBES right now, and a broad range of experts supporting us in this assessment. And I just highlight some of the parts of the executive summary from our chapter, which says that climate change is projected to be a powerful stressor on terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems in the second half of the 21st century, especially under high warming scenarios, which starts from about 2 degrees onwards, 2 to 4 degrees. An important point is also mentioned already, direct human impacts such as land use and land use change, pollution and water resource development will continue to dominate the threats to most freshwater and terrestrial ecosystems globally over the next 3 decades or so. And changing climate exacerbates other impacts on biodiversity as a kind of interaction, but the dominance will still be for the next, let's say, 2.5 decades now, mainly these human impacts which are more direct than the climate change one, but always in interaction with climate change. So ecosystem changes resulting from climate change might not be fully apparent for several decades, owing to the long response times in ecological systems. But in high altitude and high latitude freshwater and terrestrial ecosystems, climate change is exceeding those projected under RCP 2.6, which is, let's say, something above 1 degree, will lead to major changes in species distributions and ecosystem functioning, especially in the second half of the 21st century. So this long-term thing is a very important one, which is very tricky for us to handle, because at the moment we don't see so many effects. We see some already, but if we are not able to, let's say, stop the whole thing now, the whole thing will, let's say, collapse or get more difficult in a few decades from now. So a large fraction of terrestrial and freshwater species face increased extinction risk under projected climate change during and beyond the 21st century. And again, especially as climate change interacts with other pressures, habitat modification, overexploitation, pollution, invasive species. That was the same statement we had on the summary for policymakers, which is again now in the executive summary. And you might know that these reports are made in such a way that the summary for policymaker statements are traceable downwards to the chapter, to the very last detail, to the very last reference. So you have to really make all these things traceable, that everybody who is interested in the detail can really follow how we come to the conclusion. And the extinction risk is increased under all RCP scenarios, and the risk increases with both magnitude and rate of change. I said this before already, but it really has to be stressed and emphasized. At the moment, there is generally very low confidence that observed species extinctions can be attributed to recent climate change. There are very few studies which show the direct attribution. In most cases, it's not so straightforward, but models project that the risk of species extinctions will increase in the future owing to climate change. But there is a low agreement concerning the fraction of species at increased risk, the regional and taxonomic focus for such extinctions, and the time frame over which extinctions could occur. So there's still a lot of, let's say, knowledge gaps in here. It's very hard to project this. Coming to the species part, just this short, let's say, excursion to the IPBES, to the IPBES, from the pollination assessment. There we also had one chapter dealing with climate change, and this is in this chapter, drivers of change of pollinators, pollination networks, and pollination. That's a complete title, where I worked together with 3 others as CLA as well here. Here's a complete set of people working on this. There we had this climate change part, which is summarized here. So climate change for some pollinators, for example, bumblebees and butterflies, we use these 2 groups because we have quite some knowledge here. We have range changes, altered abundance, shifts in seasonal activities, and the risk of disruption of future crop pollination, an important part in terms of the human dependence on pollination and pollinators. And we can observe the climate shift across landscapes may exceed species dispersal abilities. Now we did a more in-depth study on bumblebees and butterflies, which we try to highlight in a graph. And this is a bit complex, so let me try to explain this one. So first, we have 2 sets of, let's say, graphs here. On the left, these are the ones assuming a full dispersal. On the right, no dispersal of the organisms concerned. Which means, under climate change, if you have full dispersal, all the species are able to track climate change and move into new areas, while these ones here are not at all. Then you have 3 different scenarios. They have different names now. There's a kind of 2, 3, and 4 degree scenarios, very simplified. And now if you look at bumblebees and butterflies starting on top here, which is this kind of 2 degrees scenario, you can see that, here's the explanation, you can see that there is a low climate change risk. That means loss of less than 50% of the grid cells for the majority of species under these 2 degree scenarios. And there's only a smaller portion which has a quite high, let's say, climate change risk. The red one means, for example, that more than 95% of the grid cells where the species was present before is still inhabited by the species. So if this is the case, if they are able to track climate change, and assuming that you have still habitats in the areas where you have to move to. On the right-hand side, if you're not able to move, the picture is quite different. So here there's a climate change risk, for example, this grayish ones, which says that this loss of 50 to 70% of the grid cells. And the lower one is here, and some higher ones up here. Now, if you take higher climate change effects, for example, go down to the bottom with the 4 degrees centigrade, and you're not able to move, that means that the vast majority of species, and bumblebees as well here, and butterflies, is bound to lose more than 70% of the grid cells which they have occurred before. But even if they're able to disperse, we have a large proportion of those which have a highly reduced abundance or occurrence. So this is one of the examples how we can try to estimate under different scenarios how climate change might affect, in this case, pollinators, but also insects or maybe even species. And you can see, even under the optimistic assumption that they would be able to track climate change, which they are mostly not, we face lots of problems of most of the species. So going back to the IPCC part, one of the, let's say, the final statement I want to make here has to do also with adaptation and mitigation. So the widespread transformation of terrestrial ecosystems in order to mitigate climate change, such as carbon sequestration through planting fast-growing tree species into ecosystems where they did not previously occur, or the conversion of previously uncultivated or non-degraded land to bioenergy plantations, will lead to negative impacts on ecosystems and biodiversity. Now, that's a very general statement. More specifically, in different parts of the world, there are very different effects. For example, in Europe, we often have this, let's say, biofuel production with corn, for example, which of course requires land which otherwise you might lose for agriculture, and agriculture might be used, practiced in other places, which means you also have a direct competition for habitat with the biodiversity of many of the ecosystems. So this is one of the problems with this biofuel thing, which is not trivial, and we have to really look how to mitigate climate change, maybe also with other options, other ways to produce energy. So for example, the land use scenario, which is accompanying a mitigation scenario of 2.6, which is a bit more than 1 degree centigrade, features to a large expansion of biofuel production, displacing natural forest cover. So here we have a direct trade-off between, let's say, climate mitigation and conservation of natural resources. That's surely one of the points also for future discussions, where we have to see how to solve this. There is no, let's say, bullet, no silver bullet to solve this, but it needs, let's say, local decisions on where to put which kind of mitigation activity in order not to stress too much our biodiversity. That's the last statement, which I found quite important. There are many more in the entire report, and you're welcome to look on the report also online. It's all available. So if this, it's a bit shorter than I thought, actually. With this, I want to say thank you, using one of the IPBES slides, which is about biodiversity, but also about culture on the bottom left-hand side, about the rice ecosystems, for example. So to thank you for your attention, and hope that, although I caught a cold yesterday, my voice was a bit stressed maybe, but I hope you get some of the messages, and thank you very much for listening, and leading back now to the moderators for the Q&A part. Thank you.
Thank you, Josef. We hear you well, and your voice was fine, at least here in our headquarters. I have already some questions, and basically they relate to the relationship between, let's say, human stressors and climate change stressors on ecosystem and biodiversity, because as emphasized, at least in the next couple of decades, the human factors are seems to be at least more important than climate change factors. So one question is something left to lose when climate change becomes an important factor, or not? Because if we are moving with this rate of changing the natural ecosystem, then species would go extinct just because of human pressure. So in particular, I have a couple of questions from Dina, asking where are the main causes among human activities for inducing ecosystem and biodiversity loss, and then a very specific questions related to the issue of is slightly outside the topic we treated today, but anyway related with what are the main measures that we could put in place to avoid the problem of marine littering, you know, and the issue of wasting in the ocean. So, but first of all, the most important thing is what are the most important human drivers for the extinction or losses of biodiversity in ecosystem?
First of all, the question you ask is one I also ask very often. which says, well, if you don't take care now, there is nothing to lose again later through climate change, so why should we care about climate change? So that's exactly one point I always try to make, that that's on the one hand very important. So the main stresses are well known. That's land degradation or land conversion. So if you really transform land from, let's say, forest into very different uses, maybe agriculture, maybe, I don't know, mining, whatever it is. So land use change is surely a very important one. And of course, the intensity of land use might have more subtle impacts. We in Europe discuss a lot about insect diebacks these days, which are related to intensity of land use, let's say cutting regimes in grasslands, but also application of pesticides and partly also deposition of nitrogen through the air, which changes systems quite a lot and creates quite some risk for ecosystems. So I guess it's all about land use in the end, of course, most of it. Some of them direct and some are indirect, which for example goes back to, for example, nitrogen I mentioned before, which is not only a land use related but also a living style thing. So all the nitrogen, let's say, combination which come from car traffic, for example, which was deposited later. Surely there we are also an important driver, literally, and also in the sense of a driver of the systems by, let's say, causing much deposition of nitrogen. So focusing on the present habitat requirements of species is surely a very important point, and looking for the conservation of certain areas or sustainable use of areas. It's not only about nature preserves, it's also about areas which are used by men, cultural diversity, different land use systems. Many, let's say, minorities practicing very different land use systems which seem to be quite sustainable in the local setting. So maintaining this diversity, which goes along with diversity of species per se, but also diversity of cultural species, of agrobiodiversity, for example, are surely important components which help us to, let's say, guarantee that there is something left later, which, well, so to say, might be affected by climate change, but which also might help us to, let's say, mitigate climate change, having different varieties more resistant or more tolerant to drought, for example. So preserving the diversity now is an important asset also for preserving it in the future. On the other hand, of course, we have to take care of climate change right now, because otherwise, if we are successful in maintaining the diversity nowadays, it's still a high risk in the future if we're not able to, let's say, combat climate change. So all the efforts also might have been in vain afterwards if we don't also take care about this. This is kind of this wicked problem we have here. So you have to think in the short term in terms of maintaining the present systems, and in the long term, which requires already short-term action now, in the long term to avoid this dangerous climate change. The question with the marine is, sorry, this is a bit beyond my expertise, but I could link to some people at our institution who work on this topic. So if this person would give me some contact detail, I could really provide some background information on this, but it's not my field, so I really can't tell much about this marine kind of waste problem which we have with the plastic. I think it was the plastic thing, wasn't it? Yes, I think so.
Okay, perfect. So we will put you in contact with the Dina somehow.
Yes.
Another interesting question I think that we received from our audience in remote is, given that it is so important for species having the possibility to somehow migrate and as far as possible to adapt to new, I mean, track climate change and escape from it. So the question, the explicit question is there some legally binding or some legal or some law inside being discussed inside the Paris Agreement or the International Negotiation on Climate Change, somehow conceiving corridors for species to move, the establishment of corridors, some safety valve for species to move. So is this discussed also under the legal point of view?
Well, it wasn't done in the context of the assessment, but I know, for example, from the European setting, that's a bit more the European-focused way. We have this Natura 2000 network, which to some extent tries to, let's say, contribute to this point, creating a network of habitats across Europe, which should enable some kind of, let's say, movement possibilities for species across landscapes. So that's one thing, but this is much more complicated. But there is a kind of, let's say, legal background, which is the Habitats Directive, for example, which is a directive on the European scale, and it's the Emerald Network in Eastern Europe, which is a baseline for, let's say, also offering options for species to move across landscapes. Of course, these areas are selected for certain, let's say, species compositions or for certain habitats, which might change through the climate change. So the original intention of some of these areas might not be fulfilled anymore, the original aim for the conservation. But allowing also these systems to adjust would also create still some diversity of spaces for, let's say, species coming from the south to the north in the northern hemisphere, or the other way around in the south. So there's surely some option if we don't really think we have to maintain a system at one place where sooner or later it might not fit anymore because of climatic changed conditions. But keeping this open is an important thing. I say this because in the discussion about the legal background, some people argue, well, if this habitat doesn't fulfill the original, let's say, objective anymore, we can just get rid of it. And I think this is not the right way to deal with that.
Okay. I have a question myself, which is, so I take the advantage of being the moderator to raise it.
It's always nice to be moderator.
One thing that you mentioned is the potential conflicts between mitigation strategies and the well-being of ecosystem and biodiversity. For instance, a typical mitigation measure is the production of biofuels, and we know that is very, it is quite controversial and is being debated at length. But of course, we see that the issue is very complex, and we need to take it multidimensionally. So the question is the report and the studies focusing on other kind of potential trade-off between mitigation strategies and the conservation of biodiversity and ecosystem. So I was curious to know if there is a particular field of research devoted exactly to this topic.
So that's now a bit beyond the reports I mentioned. Well, in the context of the global assessment, we are trying to move in this direction to get the knowledge summarized which is out there. So, for example, there are many other elements. For example, take wind energy and the problem of, let's say, these windmills, let's say, killing birds of prey, for example, which is a big discussion here in Germany. So there's another kind of trade-off thing where it's easier to find solutions, it looks like at least, to run these windmills at certain times of the day and certain seasons, but not all the time, and also looking at the area at which they are, where they are more prone to, let's say, have conflicts with wildlife, where they have less so. So at least there is some, let's say, some openness and willingness to find, let's say, a combination of these two to, let's say, have this alternative energy source and just say not to let's say, have too much impact on wildlife. But this is still a very ongoing thing. So in the global assessment, that's one of the aims I personally also look for and try to really get it done, is having a kind of summary of all this mitigation versus, let's say, biodiversity conflict issues, and to see where are options for, let's say, for solutions of, let's say, elaborating the solution space. But this is work we just have started, so it's still ongoing. But that's something I really want to go into because it's a very important topic, I think.
Okay, so I don't see. Just let me check a second. Okay, I don't see other questions from the floor. So I will really thank you for being with us and giving this interesting talk. I hope to host you also in the future. So perhaps with presenting new results or new studies.
Yeah, if you give us a prize next time, we will also give a presentation, of course.
Okay, we will manage. Okay, thank you very much. I say also goodbye to all the people who are attending, and I will welcome to the next webinar next time. Bye bye.
Okay, thank you very much. Bye bye.